Hello, I am Daniel Libit.
Hi, I'm Mike McCann.
And I'm Eben Novi-Williams, and this is the College Sports Year in Review sports business podcast, the Sporticast. Fellas, Scott Soshnick is tied down right now, gives us the opportunity to have a fun conversation recapping what has been a crazy year in college sports. From conference realignment, the death of the Pac-12, we have college football playoff expansion, an avalanche of antitrust lawsuits, begging Congress to step in. I'm sure I'm leaving a few other big stories off the table. I guess maybe the easiest place to start, I'm curious for both of you, is college sports in a terrible place business-wise, as a lot of people contend? Is it in a healthier place business-wise? How do you assess where we are right now in December 2023?
Well, I think it all depends what you mean by business. Obviously, it seems to be making money more than it ever has before, and that trend is the consistent upward trajectory that we find in college sports as a ongoing venture. As a thing that is going to not have to deal with constant litigation. I think it's in a terrible place. Maybe slightly better than it was a couple of years ago. It seems like it's being dragged, at least on the player compensation front, to a more balancing fulcrum against its will. But I don't think that solves the fundamental underlying challenges for college sports, which is basically that it's this Frankenstein monster that existed for decades without really anybody dealing with the financial, legal, philosophical hypocrisies and inconsistencies that it is now having to deal with. So I think it's at a point where it can improve. It is improving when we look at NIL in terms of its legal position on that. But no, I think I think we look ahead to 2024 and the years to come, and I at least see college sports in this scattered situation that it currently finds itself in.
Yeah, I agree with Daniel. I mean, the business is obviously generating tons of money, more than ever, and college sports overcame COVID and all of the worries about streaming. I mean, it just seems as if college sports is this robust thing, but when you break it down, you really see divisions that are potentially catastrophic for the future of college sports, at least as we know it. Daniel referenced the litigation. The NCAA will be in litigation probably for another decade because of what's going on now. I mean, whether college athletes are employees is a really complicated question that involves different levers, including state law, including federal law, including appellate review of what agencies do. Then we have antitrust litigation. There's all sorts of cases, including one out west, which could lead to the NCAA and Power Five conferences having to pay over $4 billion in damages. We don't know who actually pays that. Is that the NCAA? Is that the conferences? Is it the individual schools? Do insurance companies play a role? Do they all play this? Do they all pay the same thing? These are unknown answers. The answers to these questions are totally unknown, and they're hovering over college sports. And I also think we're beginning to see kind of the fraying of this behemoth. When we think of college sports, we think of the NCAA. We think of Division One. I don't view it that way anymore. I would say Division One has 30, 40 schools that are basically a pro league, which is what Charlie Baker, I think, is pushing for as a way of distinguishing them from the rest of the pack. Because if these other schools don't want to have employees and don't want to pay many millions of dollars in antitrust damages, they really have to separate themselves as businesses from those 30, 40 schools that are making a lot more on college sports than others. And how that plays out over the next few years is going to be fascinating, because as Daniel said, this model that has existed for decades is under such rebuke legally, philosophically, morally. I don't know what the core of it is anymore. If we don't know the core, how's it going to hold together?
One of the crazy things to me about this is that I feel like most people seem to know where this ends, right? And it ends with what you said, Michael, a bigger fracture of the richest schools and then everybody else. It ends with players, at least at those schools and in some sports, perhaps getting paid. Most athletic directors I talk to seem to know that. It certainly sounds like college football coaches, at least what they're saying now, their rhetoric has changed a lot in the past couple of years. They seem to actually understand that as well. And yet, I think you're both right. I think we're in this weird middle ground now where it's going to be years plural, before we get anywhere close to what I think most rational people would see as the only end result of the upheaval we're seeing now.
Well, and I'll quibble with even the concept that is the end result. I think that's a different place where college sports is, but I don't think that ends the challenges. I mean, we've started to see this year. I think this might be one of the key storylines for next year, which is the collision between Title IX and federal gender equity laws and what is considered to be the fair market compensation for college football and basketball players. I think these things are irreconcilable. I think if you want to pay college football and let's say particularly men's basketball players what they, and I'm going to use this term in air quotes, ought to be paid according to the market in a direct compensation model, there is no way that they are going to be earning what you're paying equivalently to female athletes on college campuses. I think it's well known. It's the ultimate nudge, nudge, wink, wink in college athletics. Nobody is complying with Title IX by the letter and really by the spirit. Even if you get beyond just the number of grant and aid for female and male athletes on a campus, the amount of money being spent towards men is all in every university that plays in Division I, wildly greater than what it is for women. But that is only going to get more complicated. And now we're actually seeing one lawyer in particular who is just going school by school and challenging them on their Title IX compliance. And, Mike, this is within your domain, but it just seems like he's going to have a field day. I mean, what school in its current iteration can defend itself of its Title IX practices, and then especially if you want to add on the layer of equitably or fairly compensating the so-called revenue sport athletes, that is going to just become more and more complicated. So I think on the player compensation front, just looking squarely at that and putting everything else aside, there is an endpoint that you were referencing, Eben, that it might still take years for us to get to, but I don't think that's the end of the story. I just think that's the close of a chapter.
The other piece to that is we hear about the drive for college athletes to not only become employees but to unionize. Who's in the union? That's going to have a dramatic effect on who gets paid what, because I think we're going to see conflict between college football players and men's basketball players not wanting their other classmates who are not on revenue-making teams to be in their union, because the union's going to represent all of them. And that could lead to conflict over, do you want your classmate who's on the wrestling team who is going to be part of your bargaining unit? Is that going to suppress wages? I mean, these are questions that come up throughout labor law in the U.S. They come up at universities, like who's in a faculty bargaining unit? Do you have you have certain types of professors there, not others? I mean, these are all sorts of distributional questions that we haven't even gotten to, that are going to be their own source of litigation. So, yeah, this is, I don't think college, I mean, there's an end game, but the method of getting there has so many roads it could take, and there are so many winners and losers along the way that we don't know the identities of, and that could trigger its own set of legal battles.
Starting earlier this year, there was an unknown variable in a lot of this conversation, which was a new president at the head of the NCAA. I believe Charlie Baker started in March, so we've had 9 months under his leadership. In my opinion, looks a whole lot like the leadership looked before him under Mark Emmert. How do you guys kind of assess what changed, if anything, when Charlie Baker, the former governor of Massachusetts, took over as president of the NCAA?
I think it made a little bit of an assist on the PR front and maybe on the relationships in Congress. I agree with you. I think it's substantially similar. We could even play a thought game now of if Mark Emmert hadn't retired, would there be anything really differently what's going on with the NCAA? I mean, what Baker enabled the NCAA to do is to not have the same president who had been so strident on some of these positions, including NIL, have to do the complete 180 because it's a new person, and he can always lean into the fact that he wasn't there. But he is, very conservative on the change front for the NCAA, and seems to be exhibiting the same kinds of pains to make these incremental changes, and that are being effectively forced upon the NCAA. But Michael, I'd be curious if you thought if Mark Emmert was on the seat right now, would the NCAA be behaving any differently? Do you think that Baker is any bit more forward-thinking or radical than Emmert, or is it just a different moment in time in which he's serving?
Well, I mean, the different moment in time always makes comparisons hard, right? Because it's like comparing U.S. presidents when they have very different circumstances. But I do think Baker is a little bit more forward-looking, and I think we know that because a couple things. One is when he took over, he had an interview with our own Eben Williams, where he at least distinguished college athletes. He said there's a top tier that should be treated differently. Mark Emmert never said anything like that. And then secondly, we have Baker's new proposal, which I don't know if it's going to become realistic. I mean, it's got all sorts of hurdles to it, but he at least is saying kind of the obvious. Yeah, there's like a pro league here, and we should maybe separate them from the other pieces of college sports. He's at least coming up with something. Now, I don't know if schools paying college athletes NIL directly, to me, sounds like a wage. To me, that sounds like employment status. That's a separate question. So I don't know, to what extent that's going to move forward. But I do think he's at least trying. The other thing that he'll be better at, I suspect, than Emmert is as a politician. I think he could read the room in Congress. It's probably a waste of time going to Congress and nothing's going to happen, right? We're entering an election year. An unprecedented election year where the oxygen in the room is going to be focused not on whether college athletes are employees or whether the NCAA should get an antitrust exemption or what NIL should mean on a federal level. Those are really not that important issues, I think, in the grand scheme of things. So my sense is Baker's move to push forward a proposal, I bet reflects at least him looking at his time in Congress saying, this may be a big waste.
That's interesting to me because it seemed like his hiring was largely for that one purpose in some ways, right? You learn a lot about the way a company thinks about its direction by who they choose to lead it and where that person came from. And to me, the fact that he came from politics felt like it was a very clear nod that the NCAA felt like Congress was its option and it was going to put all the eggs in that basket.
I would push back. He came from state politics. He came from Massachusetts state politics, which I know well. Yep. I used to work for the Attorney General. I mean, I worked for a DA. I know this state. He is a Massachusetts creature, and he is not. Honestly, if the goal was Congress, they should have hired a former congressperson or a former senator who may have had more suasion. Baker's confidants are at the state level. That's where he used to work for. Governor Bill Weld. I get what I think having a political person there, but to me, the fact that they picked a governor rather than a senator or a member of Congress may have an impact.
Yeah, I that's a very interesting point, Mike. Because again, ostensibly, what Eben was saying was my read on it too, and I think a lot of people's takeaway was that this was just a sort of the Hail Mary attempt to get that antitrust exemption the NCAA has never been able to get passed even out of a committee in Congress. But, the one thing that he has is he is an outsider, a college sports outsider. And I got to tell you, from my personal experience just reporting on college sports, the people who are inside at the AD level, at the NCAA level previously, have been the worst at reading the room and just reading the situation. Even when I talk to, not to insult sources of mine, but even when I talk to people regularly who are very much creatures of college athletics and how they've predicted over the last 2 or 3 years the way the change will come, the rate of change, they've been wildly off. And the best people for seeing, the future, at least the current future we're experiencing, have been, economists and academics and people who have kind of looked at this from the outside and have been much derided for their ivory tower perspectives on where things were headed. But yeah, I mean, everything that we're seeing right now has been prophesied by professors more than athletic directors.
Staying on this topic, there was a time, let's say 20, 25 years ago, where a lot of athletic directors were rising from within athletics. They were either famous coaches that had already coached there or had been in the athletic department for a while. Then we saw this shift towards development. We saw a lot of people coming from fundraising, coming up to be athletic directors because that was the new game. It was how well can you separate famous local alumni from their money and schmooze and be personable and walk into a room and walk out with $1 million check. Now, a lot of that guard is retiring. We've seen a huge turnover next year. I think we're going to see even more. Some of the most famous athletic directors in the country, Jack Swarbrick, Gene Smith, are either stepping down, they're deciding they don't want to do the job anymore. I'm really curious to see what the next group of leaders come on. As we talk about Charlie Baker, there are some athletic directors that you could argue are more powerful, are more influential than he will be moving forward in shaping the way that colleges make money off sports, the way in which athletes are compensated. And I'm really curious if this new class comes from finance backgrounds, which we've seen in a few places, Graham Neff at Clemson, for example, or if it's a totally different area that I'm not thinking about, that I think will again, in some ways, kind of tip the hand or show the way that elite college sports, I'm talking about at the SEC and the Big Ten levels, what they're thinking about, what they need next in leadership in the next 10 to 15 years.
Yeah, we're even seeing that, certainly at the level of conference commissioners as well. There is this search, sure. And I think that's a right-minded search for finding people who are outside of the industry, because the industry, having institutional knowledge of the industry over its last 20, 30 years is not really getting you the right perspective on where things ought to go. And people are coming from finance. They're coming a lot from media. I mean, so much of this is being driven by television revenue and streaming revenue that you're seeing at the conference level. Maybe you'll see this even at the AD level. People coming from ESPN or CBS Sports or Learfield or so forth. The media component wagging this whole operation. But and then there's the other thing that people don't ever like to talk about, which is maybe where things get complicated again if some of these present issues are tamped down or resolved, and that is kind of this strange relationship that's going to only become more strange between higher education and big time college sports. It already feels tenuous.
Does it exist? I mean,
no.
Do you think
For all intents and purposes,
yeah.
No, except in that everybody's agreeing that there is a relationship. But it's perhaps not fair that this is going to fall on players when players start earning more and more money. But I can foresee that being the case, that this is going to give rise to more questions and louder criticisms about what does this have to do with any kind of nonprofit exercise, and what does this have to do with these institutions of higher learning. And that's once again another front that we're really not, those noises are not really being made these days. It's really athlete compensation rights leading the charge, but I think that's lurking around the shoulder.
Well, we should talk about. I think we can make that noise now in some ways, right? We reported earlier this year that Florida State was in talks with J.P. Morgan raising potentially private equity money from outside. Sixth Street was what I had heard was the main group involved. But once you have athletic departments at public schools trying to raise institutional money from hedge funds or from private equity to fund athletics. Yeah, I think that tether fully breaks at some point in the next few years. And whether that's a formal spin-off of football and men's basketball or just football alone or whatever it is, I just don't see, as much as schools in the Big Ten obviously love to talk about the academic side of the Big Ten membership and what that all means. Some of the schools they've let in recently maybe don't align with what they were talking about the academic standards were a decade ago. Yeah, I think that is one of those fallacies that I would put in that category of everyone knows where this ends up. It's just how long does it take to get to that line being severed completely.
Well, and college sports does not want that. I mean, the Ann Arbor Wolverines are not going to get 100,000 people in the football stadium. It's very important. It's, this is where college sports has been built around. The mystique, the kind of sense of community is built around these universities, even if most fans really don't care, in that realm about the academics component of this or the university itself. But so I think it's going to be very hard. Even if college sports effectively severs in every other way, I think there's this need to still be tied, still have the branding of the university, and
agreed on the branding for sure.
Absolutely.
I don't think these are all mutually exclusive. I would say, look at other college departments. They take money from private funding. They do partnerships with businesses. I don't think taking money, an athletic department getting linked to some sort of business, it would have tax implications in terms of the tax break that they get. It would have potential implications if the athletes are employees. But I would say, honestly, a lot of colleges and university presidents are pretty entrepreneurial because even public universities, look at how much money they actually get from their state. Most of these public universities are really private in all sorts of ways.
Not a lot, yeah.
Right? It's not a lot, and it's going down. And I think the nimble college president is now trying to develop partnerships, and I think could be the athletic department, it could be the physics department, it could be I don't know, the media department. I mean, there are all sorts of associations. So in that regard, I think college sports taking money isn't as transformative. I mean, it's transformative because it's sort of the opposite of amateurism, right? But amateurism doesn't really exist, right? I mean, look at these TV deals. I mean, let's just throw that out the window. Let's be realistic. And I would say embrace opportunities if I were an athletic department. And if I were a university president, I would be pushing for that because I don't want to be reliant on public funding.
Yeah, that's a good point. And we also have to remind myself this all the time is that, higher education is not a fixed point. We're in this strange and convoluted moment in the way in which universities are operating, the entire structure of their budgets, and we're seeing, not at the Division I school levels, but we're seeing a lot of, smaller liberal arts schools going away because they can't sustain themselves. And we're seeing tuition going crazy. So, just as much as college sports is going to change, college is going to change, perhaps, just as dramatically over the next decade as well.
Especially with demographic changes. If you look at the population, there's a dip coming in terms of enrollments at a lot of schools. So they're going to have fewer students. It's going to be more competition for a smaller group of students. We hear constant references, sort of critiques of higher ed that people shouldn't go to college if it's going to cost $80,000. Do something else with your time. I mean, these are all constraints on, we're talking about college sports, but they're part of this larger entity that's facing all sorts of challenges.
Mike, I'll admit, I get total whiplash thinking about all of the lawsuits that have been filed against the NCAA and where they stand. If you can, because I imagine some of our listeners probably feel the same way, what's the most concise way to kind of sum up either the ones that are maybe the biggest threat to the NCAA or really kind of where we are? Because I know there were a few filed even in the past couple weeks as well. Just where the biggest liabilities are and what the main thrust of these lawsuits are.
Yeah, the big one to watch is the one out in California. It's the class. Sometimes it's called House v. NCAA, but it's actually the title of it has changed. It's a class action lawsuit involving now over 14,000 college athletes who were from the Power Five conferences who are suing, arguing that the NCAA and the conferences illegally conspired under antitrust law to prevent conferences from paying the athletes TV money. So that's TV money of the past, it's TV money of the present, it's TV money of the future. Billions of dollars that could have gone to athletes in contracts with different networks. That case also involves, if NIL was okay in 2021, 2022, and 2023, why wasn't it okay in 2020? How about all those athletes who could have made money on NIL, right? That's part of the case too. And the case also says if the NCAA had allowed players to be in video games and not forfeit their eligibility, EA would have made a bunch of games, more money for athletes. The thing about this case that's different is two things. One, it's certified as a class action. Sometimes we see class action lawsuit. They're not actually class actions. They have to be certified, which doesn't come till much later. And a lot of lawsuits don't get certified. But this one has, so it has that feature. The other thing that matters, it got past a motion to dismiss. What does that mean? It's in pretrial discovery. And a class action lawsuit that gets past a motion to dismiss is a nightmare for a defendant, particularly when it's antitrust law. It's super expensive. It's invasive. The damages could be in the billions. The question becomes, how do you settle this? The NCAA has called it the death knell. This is the NCAA saying it, not me. And it's because I don't know how you fix it. How do you get out of it? And who pays what? This to me is a disaster, an unfolding disaster for the NCAA in ways that none of these other ones are. I mean, the other ones might become that way, but they're not there yet. There's also a new case involving challenging college, the grant and aid, basically saying, why can't college athletes get paid their market value? That was the original Alston argument, and it got rejected. I'm not saying it's going to happen here, but we'll see. That case is not going to. It's Cunningham. It's going to be years before it plays out. The other sort of genre of legal controversies for the NCAA is whether college athletes are employees. There's a case involving a petition involving USC football players, men's and women's basketball players. There is Johnson v. NCAA, which is a lawsuit saying that college athletes are employees under the FLSA, which would mean they get paid minimum wage and overtime pay. And then the one involving Dartmouth men's basketball players. Honestly, that may be the worst one if you're college sports, because that one is moving fast. And it's already had a hearing in Boston. They're waiting for a ruling from the regional director. It will get appealed to the board in D.C., and then it'll go to court. It's not going to end for years, but that one is moving fast. And if Dartmouth basketball players are employees, who is it? Right? I mean, think about it. I mean, think of that's a program that has small attendance. Now they're going to say, wait a second, that doesn't matter, because under employment law, how many people are there doesn't matter. If Dartmouth says they're losing money, that doesn't matter either. That's not irrelevant. It's an interesting point that might be in a headline, but it's not an actual legal matter. And they also know, it's interesting. Some of these players have part-time jobs. They already have Dartmouth as their employer. They're already paying taxes. And then they have classmates in dining services who are in a union. So the idea that you can't be a student and an employee is totally false. It's totally false at these same schools. So it's such a fascinating time. And I would say, these things aren't going to end tomorrow. We'll probably still be talking about them when we do this thing next year. But it's moving in the direction. If I were the NCAA, I would be really, really worried.
It just seems like the end point is, the NCAA doesn't have billions of dollars. It's a pass through to these schools. So short of it having the world's greatest liability insurance policy, it seems like its fate is in bankruptcy court at a certain point. What settlement could it possibly strike with these classes that would be satisfactory? Do you have any thoughts on that?
It's a great question. What would it take to convince these athletes? How much money do they want? And the lawyers, of course, are going to get a huge cut of this. This is going to be. This is great for the lawyers. I'll just put it that way.
Yeah, I know who the winner is here. Yeah,
the winners are the lawyers who are going to make a small fortune, not a small fortune, a real fortune from this case, a true, real fortune, life-altering fortune from this litigation. And Daniel, I don't know what the number is, and I guess it depends on who we're talking about, right? I mean, if some college basketball players may say I should get a lot more. I mean, this goes back to the issue of they all don't want the same thing, right? If you're a star player, shouldn't you get more than the bench warmer? I don't know. That could be it could be interesting for us to look at. Like, what is the number that makes a settlement possible?
Daniel, you wrote something earlier this year, a really good story about the Big Ten's kind of leadership transition from Kevin Warren to Tony Petitti, Tony being a college sports outsider. And one of the things you found was this tension between kind of the old guard in the Big Ten and the new guard. And I'm curious, looking back on that reporting, what you think you took away from a lot of what we're talking about here, this as college sports thrusts into totally new ground, the fact that there are people that want to hold it back, and then there's people that want to move it forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's consistent sort of with the theme you just pointed out. I mean, because there's still, college sports is still very much, there's so much history it has, and it's built up so much infrastructure over these last several decades that even as it tries to change, it is a slow-moving ship, and there's a lot of internal resistance to change, and not all change necessarily is good. I mean, in many ways, the fact that it's so profitable shows that it has done something right if you're looking purely from a mercantilistic perspective. But there is that kind of thing. You mentioned, this wave of retirements of ADs. We've seen at the conference level, at the power conference level especially, a whole new crop of commissioners who have come out from a very different background, including Petitti and, for that matter, Kevin Warren. And yet we still have a lot of the same people and a lot of the same thinking that's permeates at the conference level, at the NCAA level, and so change is hard. The fact that there's not real organized unification among athletes or among administrators also makes it difficult. There's a lot of cross purposes and different agendas. You can see this. That was kind of the microcosm I found in reporting. A long feature about Kevin Warren's tenure, and then more recently about Petitti's. But there's a lot of internal struggle. So even as college sports is dealing with all of these outside threats. And let's say the establishment of college sports is dealing with a lot of these outside threats. It's also dealing with a lot of internal discord because there are, a new wave of people and differing thoughts and yet a lot of existing credo as well.
Yeah, the word amateurism, it was historically used to apply to athletes. I have found in covering this space for the last 10 years that you could apply it just as easily to the business approach that a lot of these conferences and universities have. And I do think that is changing. Stadiums being a perfect example. I think the way professional sports teams think about stadium development and financing and economics is so drastically different than even the highest end college football programs think about it. Even though 110 people go to Ann Arbor Wolverines games, Daniel, but only 80,000 go to the biggest NFL games every week. I think there's going to be a big revolution in that regard.
Well,
as well.
And we've ripped the facade off. I mean, that's the other thing, and that was what I noticed at the Big Ten. We see this in general, is that as much money is being made, there's still been this effort to portray college sports as something that's not purely commercial. And so people have been slow or slower to fully embrace this in all ways, the reality of college, of the industry in all ways. And I think certainly over the last couple of years with NIL has come this sense that, we don't need to pretend anymore. And we can get on with the business of the business. And so we're seeing that now. And but it was a long time coming, given that this has been a multi-billion-dollar industry for a while. It didn't just happen in July of a few years ago. It's been that way for a while.
So we should wrap up, and I want to wrap up maybe by having each of us give a bold prediction for what we see in the crystal ball for college sports in 2024. I'm happy to go first. I've got two, one small one and one bigger idea. The small one being, I think the NCAA makes a big step towards sports betting at some point in the next 12 months. It is the last major U.S. sports league that has not fully embraced all of the money that comes along with sports betting data partnerships and also partnerships with sports books. It took a step back this year after reporting from the New York Times. There's lots of reasons why it's a thornier issue in college sports than it is in professional sports. But as we talk about the increased professionalization, the facade being ripped off, there's a lot of money on the table. We've talked about why the NCAA might need it as well. I think we're going to see some progress or steps forward in that direction. And then more broadly, whether it's Florida State or it's somebody else, I think in the next 12 months, we see some school, some athletic department make a big step in reorganizing, refinancing, whatever it is, the way it thinks about athletics, either taking football apart, taking football and the basketball programs apart, separate funding model, giving up equity in the commercial rights, whatever that looks like. I think we see someone make a big step at some point soon.
You want to go, Daniel? You go.
Sure. I'm sort of now applying a reverse dog year calculation to my predictions in college sports. Anything that you think was going to happen in 7 years, you can now assume will happen in a year. And so in that spirit, I think there is going to be something put in play in the next 12 months of directly compensating athletes. I don't even know if that's a bold prediction anymore after Charlie Baker put it on the table, or at least put a proposal on the table. But I think, there will be something by December of 24, a plan in place with a set deadline of when at least certain kinds of college athletes will earn certain kinds of revenue directly from the schools. And again, this is the question. I've been poll testing sources for the last 3 years, and if we were talking a year ago, I feel like most people who I spoke to would say, "Oh, that's coming, but that's 5-10 years down the road." But everything that has supposed to have taken place 5 or 10 years down the road ends up taking place in 2 or 3 months down the road, with maybe NIL collectives being my favorite example. So yeah, I think at some point in this coming year, that is going to be put into some sort of effect.
I don't know if it's going to happen next year, but I do think the NCAA settles the in-ray college athlete NIL litigation. It's just too much. It's truly a death blow if they don't. I mean, I literally can't see them going to trial, which is scheduled for 2025. So 2024 is important here. Now it could get pushed back, so I'm mindful of that. But this case is such a frightening piece of litigation for the NCAA that I don't know how they don't settle it. And I bet it becomes a real focus point for Baker and his staff and his legal counsel. But really, and this goes to Daniel's point about where's the money, they got to figure out who pays what is the role of insurance. These are hard questions. I don't know the answer to them. I don't think they know the answer to them. And so that's my prediction. They settle the case.
Well, guys, we'll have you back on in 12 months, and we will play these clips back, and we'll see how we did. Thank you very much to Mike McCann. He is the foremost expert in college sports law out there. You can find him on Twitter at McCann Sports Law. Thank you to Daniel Libit. He is the foremost expert in college sports hypocrisy. You can find him on Twitter at Daniel Libit. I am Eben Novi-Williams. You can follow me on Twitter at Novi_Williams. The Sporticast is produced by Aaron Greenewald. Thank you very much to Aaron. Sportico's digital media editor, Cora Veltman, would like you to know that you can follow the show at Sporticast, which is the hub of the Sportico Media Network.